Hello, and welcome to the recap for our Thursday evening community conversation. So, in this evening's conversation, we were talking about self-development and the difficulty that one's ego can play. And so, we essentially looked at three different kind of situations. I started out with giving them some ideas to consider, and then we opened it up for general conversation. So, the general idea is that there are many of us who have a difficult time accepting advice, taking advice, or continuing self-development because of not connecting with or networking with others, or listening to the wise counsel or advice of others. And so that was the kernel kind of that got us started. And so at first I expanded the picture pretty big, and then we made it smaller. So three main points that we kind of gathered the conversation around, if you would, was first, one of the ego difficulties is that it can make you think that you are different in ways that you're not. Now, is it true that we're all different from one another? Sure. Is it true, though, that there are some important similarities or sameness? Well, yes, and so we opened that up. So one was thoughts about being different in some ways. Two was being better. In other words, I don't have to accept advice or listen to anybody because I'm just better than everybody else. So we had to work through that one. And then third, what if you really are a genius? And so how does that balance then work between listening to others and all right. So that was the underlying foundation, if you would, for the conversation. So to the question of, or to the point of, what if you're thinking that you're different in some way? So I had a few examples for each of those three categories. So for this example, we talked about a conversation that Socrates actually has, Plato has through the mouth of Socrates in the beginning of the Republic. And to make a long story short, Socrates' character is talking to another character about life advice and things like that. And one of the things that the gentleman imparts upon Socrates is that younger folks don't plan to be older folks. And so as a result, they're unprepared, things don't work out. So we expounded upon that a bit. And so taking it back to the initial title about it being an ego thing, so that the ego thinks of itself as separate and not a part of the grand consciousness that's connected to all things. And so then the ego thinks it's different and not the same in the sense of being disconnected. And so what often happens is a person in a certain ism, so a certain age group or a certain identity category or what have you, then thinks that that identity makes it where they're different and can't accept any kind of input from anyone else. So we zeroed in on that conversation that the guy was having with Socrates because, quite often there are folks, let's say we're a younger person who doesn't want to listen to an older person because they think they're a different kind of thing, if you would, like, oh, what's that old person know? And so we talked about that, how the self develops and grows, and we end up, growing in body and mind and kind, but we don't think of ourselves as becoming different things, that we're still ourselves as we grow in age. And as we're younger, it can be more difficult to understand that, to recognize that we're taking a journey of sorts and that there are others who've been through the same journey. Instead, we kind of can fall into the ego and ism to say that's a different thing, an other, and not the same as me at a different point of development that it would be a good idea for me to listen to. So that, was a recap of the first. The second point about, well, I'm just better. So the idea there is the ego, again, being separate from the idea of being connected lovingly to the whole. The ego ends up saying, well, nobody can possibly know as much as me about it, or my thoughts about it are the best about it, and so I can't take any kind of an input. So the example I use for that one is motorcycle racing. So at the pinnacle of the sport in GP, it looks, they're in serious competition. So you would think that they are not collaborating, or what have you, to try to, but the truth is, there's a sense in which they really are. Now, it ends up coming to bear, or we see it happen here more recently as the electric bikes start to race. Because what we have forgotten is that the combustion engines, like in GP, they've been refined over so many generations that the competition looks a certain way. But whenever we saw the electric bikes being introduced, well, what happens then is you have these, manufacturers come or people come who produce them, and they're so wildly different with so different performance characteristics that they can't actually have, legitimate races at first. So then they have to see like who's making the best power source, who's making it where it doesn't blow up, catch on fire, who has a lighter bike. So collaboration then allowed them to get closer and closer until they could have what looked like races. Now then you go into your own workshops again and everybody's doing it in isolation, but it was definitely a community effort. Now, but it continues that way because let's suppose in the pinnacle of the sport, in GP, when one manufacturer comes out with something new or different, everybody else is looking at it, they're taking pictures of it, and before you know it, they come out with the same thing on their bike. So there is a collaboration of sorts, in a way of speaking, as we would say, and they're, in bitter competition. So being better, even if in competition they do want to be better, but they still recognize that they have to learn from everybody else, even the competitors whom they want to be better than. So we use that as the basis to kind of talk about the getting out of the ego of I'm better and recognizing I'm the same as in the fundamental spirit sense. And we can connect to collaborate in a good way as opposed to trying to separate because actual development is slowed in that way. And we had a lot of examples about that. We started, we talked a lot. We talked about refinement of music, the refinement of, in genres of music and that kind of thing. So it was a good conversation. And then last but not least, our third point, we talked about, well, what if you really are a genius? And then it's the other way. You have to temper listening to people, but only at a certain point of the refinement. So the examples that I brought up in this case were Nikola Tesla, and then to go back even before that was Michelangelo Buonarroti. So Michelangelo, serious genius. Now everybody is, well, maybe not everybody, but he is considered a master artist in at least 4 disciplines. So you have painting, sculpting, architecture, but also poetry. He wrote beautiful poetry that they don't often, talk about, I think for social reasons, but it's considered extremely good. Now, the thing is, he didn't want to take advice from anybody. He was known for being, significantly aware of his own genius and saying nobody else had an input. There are some famous stories about it. But at the same time, if you were to ask him, you read his biography, if you were to ask him, where does this skill come from? He feels like it's divinely inspired, directly connected with God. It's not even though it's the tortured genius, it's not the same as the ego that just says I'm better. It's the ego that says I'm not the ego. I'm connected to the divine source. And this is how this stuff is getting produced. So we talked about that, that in the genius, there's a certain kind of refining on his own he had to do. However, further research has shown us that even Michelangelo, in his beginnings, when he started painting, he definitely trained under another painter. He definitely imitated some of those techniques early, and we see this. There are some old sketches that they have in museums that show kind of his thought process, and we see some of them that kind of help to indicate that he took a lot of cues from his early teachings. Now, these are things that he would deny, right? So there's a balance that we see with Michelangelo. We see the balance between him being the genius of, I know this because I'm the genius and I've been, divinely inspired, but I also have to be trained in certain things and figure out certain techniques even as I'm developing new techniques. So there was a balance. And we told a similar story about Nikola Tesla, being genius, being inspired because he says he's connected to the grander consciousness scene. And talking about him having training, but just outdoing the folks whom he was training under. So it ended up being a case still demonstrating that he was not withdrawn into the ego, saying this is coming out of my own ego mind. He would very much, Nikola Tesla, from what we read, say that he was connected. That he was connected to higher consciousness, perhaps even suggesting he was connected to other beings who had higher consciousness to include the divine revelation. So those are the three main points that we kind of centered the conversation around, and we got a lot of good information out, but it also felt like it was the beginning of the conversation. So 2 weeks time we will have part 2 of self-development and helping to put the ego in check. Hopefully you'll be able to come join us, and if not, stay tuned for that reflection.